We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Here we go. G'day and welcome to another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there's more than one way to be a man. But even simpler way to explain that is we're trying to simplify manhood because it seems pretty confusing these days for a lot of men out there as to how they find their place in their communities, in their families, in the culture. That is, of course, in itself very, very confusing. So I'm excited to welcome Stef to join us today, mate. It's been really cool watching your work that you're doing in the world. The world being so as small as it is, you're actually a new warrior brother who went through the new warrior training adventure about 10 years ago in Western Australia. So that's really cool, mate. I'm excited to have you here and get stuck into bringing out some of the gold that you bring with you.
Yeah, thanks, man. I was sharing with my wife, it was a few weeks ago when you reached out to me. I said, we were on a walk and I said, hey, you're not going to believe who just reached out to me, Mankind Project, to jump on a podcast. And she looked at me and she goes, oh, yeah, okay. I said, that's better than any of these other top podcasts reaching out to me. This is substance. This is meaningful, you know? And I was genuinely excited, man. I feel very honored and humbled that an organization that's been around for, I think, nearly 50 years, if not longer.
Yeah, 40 year
like late
birthday.
70s or early 80s or something. Yeah. As as making a real dent in the world and has in a positive way for men and the families of men and communities that men live in for so long. It's a really beautiful thing, man. So, and I had a remarkable experience initially, all those years ago. So, yeah, it feels special to be here, man.
Beautiful. Well, I could tell we were going to get there quick because we took a moment to check in before we went live, and it gives me a chance to feel you right before we get rocking and rolling. And mate, you've got a remarkable story that has led you to this place in life now, living in the States. So trained behavioral scientist, now a relationship expert, 20 years of experience working and mixing psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and getting to work with a large breadth of people. You've got fighters, you've got special forces, you've got couples, you've got men and women. Mate, give us a little bit of an insight into kind of the early days of your journey. And that's what I want to go to, because in preparing for this conversation, your early life really resonated with me. And I know a lot of men who come to this work would probably resonate with it as well. So please, the mic is yours. Take it away. We'd love to get to know you a little better.
Yeah, man. You speak about my earlier life, and thank you for your lovely, kind words as well. I think about my earlier life, and I'm in the process of writing my book, and it's being released September 23rd, 2025 through Hay House Publishing, and I'm really excited for that. I'm very, very humbled and grateful as well. It's a dream publisher. And I've been spending a lot of time. Part of the book is sharing a little bit of my personal experience and what I grew up with personally, and what I made that, what my nervous system made that mean, and what I made that mean relationally and behaviorally growing up as an adult in my romantic partnerships, sexuality, self-worth, things of pursuit, etc. And so this is all really fresh for me as I spent a couple of hours last night writing as well, and do the same tonight. So, my upbringing was one of violence, volatility, uncertainty, instability, parents really fighting a lot with each other, with physical violence, emotional abuse towards myself and my brother. My brother's 5 years younger than me. There was entanglement and enmeshment, emotional incest, if you like, with my mother. I'm giving you the high level sort of perspective here,
Sure.
And we can go into the weeds of anything you wish to, but I have no problem talking about any of it. I think about that and what how it shaped me and how it shaped my relationship to myself and specifically to women, to intimacy, I should say. And how disconnected that was for so long, man. And still, like, the after effect of that still lingers, that very intense formative period of my life where I was exposed to so much intensity. And let me be super clear, man, this isn't me comparing trauma, because we should not compare trauma. It's a
Never.
dangerous game to play, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because trauma for me is not only, it's less about the experience and more how our nervous systems interpret the experience. And I'm very aware that some people move through horrific, chronic bouts of intensity, whether it's living in a war-torn country or being sexually abused for, decades on end. The list goes on and on, right? And when the nervous system develops a fragility and the nervous system develops an aptitude for disorganization or hypervigilance, it takes time to unravel that, right? It takes not only time but very deliberate practice, and sometimes that practice has to be very linear. Sometimes that practice needs to be fluid. But it is, just reflecting now, like even seeing, I'm sort of in that, like yourself, I've got a 2.5-year-old. She's 3 in March, and it's just man, what a gift, bro! Like, what a gift. I mean, I don't even know what to say. It just,
you don't need to. I get it.
Man, how she's just opened up my heart. Like, her presence, her mere, just her sheer presence is just phenomenal. Her energy, her life force, but what that's also activating in me and what it's asking me to look at again and readdress and be with again in a different way, particularly some of my patterns around my impatience and reactivity, my agitation, how I become defensive or reactive when I feel that or I perceive myself to be overwhelmed or under pressure. The sort of violent aspect of me, or the aggressive aspect of me. I think violence is a strong word, but the aggressive aspect of me is too strong of a word to describe me per se in that sense. But that part that just has very little tolerance, and it's not an all the time part, but it's a part, right? And so, I always lean into the quote of Carl Jung, and I'm paraphrasing here: you can't do the second half of life like you did the first half of life, because you're missing something incredibly powerful in terms of your growth. And I like to look at it in phases. You can't live your 30s or your 40s like you live your 30s, your 30s like you live your 20s. There's a different energetic that runs through that, right? That runs through that time period, as an example. If we just use that decade time period and what it actually means from a developmental perspective. And we sometimes as men, we hold on to the past because we think it's our glory days, or we have a misconstrued conception of what it was. It's a little
guilty.
It's not completely accurate. It's a little delusional. And so there's that sort of fight coming up, because one of my biggest wounds is freedom, and one of my biggest values is freedom. And so having a child, which naturally, if you care and you want to be a present parent and a conscious parent, however you define that, it requires time and attention and responsibility. And responsibility for me, and at least in my body, can be associated with lack of freedom or contraction of freedom. And so that brings out that shadow part of me that doesn't want to lose my freedom. And so I'm having these very intricate, deep conversations. I'm wrestling with these parts of me. And that's sort of where I'm at now. And when you asked that original question around my upbringing, all of that I experienced in my upbringing is sort of coming back to me a little bit now to be with in a new way, right? Not that I haven't addressed it or haven't been with it before, but to be with it in a new way, because I've had this very new and big experience of having a child, which now reshapes my constitution, reshapes my nervous system, reshapes my outlook and purview on the world as well.
Very well said. It's almost like having to renegotiate with the experience growing up and going, okay, so if my belief is it's not what happened to me, it's the meaning I made of it, or it's how my nervous system kind of attached to it, then how can I renegotiate that relationship? And you bring up something interesting in these different parts of you. I have found so much beauty in how I have shown up in a different way than I ever have since becoming a father. And I have also seen some of the ugliest sides of myself I have ever seen since becoming a father. Because holy moly, sleep deprivation, a kid that goes from eating everything to not wanting to touch a thing, her jumping on my testicle or whatever. Like, just like all these different moments that catch me off guard. I kind of relate it to, there's very few people in this world that can truly hurt me. But my wife, like, there it is, like knife's in your hand, heart is right there. She has free access to swing or stab. And I find that with my little one too. If she goes against my wishes or whatever, it's like a personal affront.
And they're 2 years old, right?
She's just knocking on 2 years old, and it's like her little prefrontal cortex doesn't even make meaning of her trying to hurt daddy or whatever.
Correct.
But I take it so personal, and I'm like, golly, how am I reacting and responding this way to a 1-year-old? It's wild. And you're right. You said mirror. It's a mirror. And witnessing her grow up with such freedom and not a care in the world, it's reminding me of like, man, when did I lose that? At what point was that dropped? And she's teaching me. As much as I feel a responsibility to teach her, it's like being open to receive those lessons as well. And it sounds like you're getting take 2 at childhood by being a parent.
That's what parenthood is, man. Parenthood is an opportunity for us. It's a number of things, but parenthood is an opportunity for us to look at our inner selves and our inner child and who we were at the age of our little ones, right? And let them be a reflection back to us for something deeper. That's the powerful journey of parenthood, if we allow it to. And in healing that, and it may even sound selfish at some levels, but in healing that within ourselves, we become better parents. I think what's really important, you touched on something very powerful. You said, when did we lose that sense of, my words, not yours, innocence, freedom, ability just to be free in the world? The world, culturally and socially, is going to get you in that way. There's nothing you can do to escape that per se. But what I can do as a parent is delay that as long as possible for my little one by being a very safe space, by having my own nervous system regulated, by not being reactive as a human. And she's worth so much. The investment, if you like, the love that I have for her is so expansive that I'm willing to go to hell and back and heaven and back and anywhere and back to ensure that I do my absolute best to keep my nervous system regulated, to not be reactive, to not live from shadow and wound, to really hold a space and steward a space of safety for her, to remain in her innocence and in her freedom for as long as she can and as long as she desires to.
And easier said than done.
100%.
We're thrilled to have BetterHelp as a sponsor for the Mankind podcast. BetterHelp matches you with a licensed therapist for live one-on-one sessions, someone trained to listen, support, and offer helpful insights. If getting one-on-one support feels like a good direction for you, I invite you to check it out. Go to betterhelp.com/mankind and get 10% off your first month of therapy.
You talk about culture, and this is something I'm going on the radio tomorrow. I do about once a month. I go on the local talk radio, and generally they bring me on to talk about like manhood, masculinity, boyhood psychology, just basically like talking about the culture of manhood. And I certainly don't consider myself an authority in any way, but I've been fortunate to have a front row seat to many conversations about it, this podcast namely, and men's groups over the past 8 years. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Mark Green. He's a phenomenal writer and does a lot of work on writing about the man box, which I'm sure you're aware of, the rigid definitions of what it means to be a man. that we learn from a young age, and culture very much influences that. And he said some things in my conversation with him yesterday that just really landed with me. And let me give some context before I do that. When looking for guests for the show, especially male influencers, and I hope that doesn't...
I'm offended.
Yeah, exactly. It's been nice talking to you all today. This has been the Mankind Podcast, the shortest episode in history. Peace. But, men that have a voice, they have a platform, they have a message, they have a channel. And when I hear voices like yours, men that can talk about difficult, tricky, nuanced, taboo topics, and you do a great job to give context, and you do a great job to give multiple perspectives, and I judge you to be responsible in what it is that you're sharing. Juxtapose that to someone like, like an Andrew Tate, right? Or a Wes Watson, or whoever those characters are. When I meet people with your kind of voice and your kind of message, I'm like, what can we do to amplify that? Because, and this is where I get to Mark's quote. He said, your kids get recruited when they don't feel connection with their families. And that when kids feel seen and heard by their fathers, the Andrew Tates of the world don't resonate.
No argument on my end, brother. And another way to say it for me is that if your child, or if that individual child feels safe enough in their own constitution and self-assured enough, because that's what's been instilled in their homes, they're less easily influenced and manipulated by external forces. They can withstand more pressure. They have a higher window, a broader, deeper window of tolerance. They have greater levels of discernment, and they're more self-aware and therefore more aware of the bullshit that's in the world.
Bingo. They've got their detectors turned on. And what Mark said, the best way to instill that in your kids is demonstrate it. Demonstrate your range. Let them see your humanity. Yeah. He said, in talking with fathers, he said a lot of fathers don't want to raise weak sons, because they don't want them to be hurt, perhaps the way they were hurt. But in turn, sons don't want to disappoint their fathers by being emotional or showing weakness. And it creates this horrible standard, in a way, of like, this is what it needs to be to grow up as a proper man, let's just say. And the argument, and not that this is new information for me, I've been very fortunate to have a father who went through the Mankind Project when I was 9 years old. So he modeled this beautifully, is to show your children your range. Like, and yeah, guess what? Sometimes daddy blows his lid and says something he shouldn't. But did you also notice that daddy repaired and asked for forgiveness and apologized, right? Maybe cried. Or it's giving kids access to your humanity. And in turn, the pressure dial kind of gets turned down as well for having to be this perfect role model of manhood and masculinity for your son or your daughter.
Yeah.
This is very much alive in me right now. If you can't already tell.
It's a great thing to be alive, brother. It means you're cognizant of your parenthood and the vital, integral role. I mean, your modeling of masculinity and manhood is going to be the first imprint of masculinity and manhood that your daughter receives, and that she will unconsciously and consciously bring into the world with respect to how she allows men and the energetic of masculinity into her life. And so your awareness around that, and you being a safe, stable, predictable, in a healthy way, space for your little girl is fucking everything. I mean, it's everything, man. And often when it comes to re-regulating the nervous system and closing trauma loops, repair is more important than the event itself. You know, of course, if we can avoid tumultuous or intense events, great. And if we can't, for whatever reasons, or they happened, then repair is a beautiful thing, and often can even be more powerful, because the range piece you're speaking to is something I personally pride myself on. And that range piece builds resilience. And resilience is something that is, in my opinion, so missing in our society, in our world today. Healthy
Thank you.
resilience,
Healthy
especially
resilience.
socially, right? Like emotionally and relationally.
Yeah.
We're just so triggered. We're walking around in our shadows, living from our shadows.
Yes. Yes. And that's often something that I'm talking to a lot of people. I do a lot of work. I mean, the Mankind Project inherently works in and around mental health. And we put on an annual Men's Mental Health Matters event here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The city gets behind it. It's wonderful. We have hundreds of people show up each year. And, you know, we have...
I've got to turn up to one of those.
Oh, mate, it's brilliant. We have like 60 people cold plunge in the center. We have live music. We have people telling stories. We bring in all the mental health centric nonprofits that we have. We don't make it an MKP thing. We bring in Dads Making a Difference. It helps, you know, fathers navigate the judicial system with custody. We bring in, you know, NAMI. We bring in Movember, like all these different organizations. And one thing I made clear from the jump in organizing this event is if we're talking about mental health without talking about resilience, then we're just jumping in the mud and throwing a pity party for how tough life is. It's
good point.
How does this horrible thing you're going through, how can that be transmuted, transformed into lightening the load for the next person to go through this difficult thing, and you can be that salvation for them? You know, why are some of the most impactful AA mentors or, you know, AA program workers the ones who themselves went through the ugliest forms of addiction? Right? It's because they've lived it, they've breathed it, and I judge they've gone, how has this happened for me? And it's hard in the moment to see it that way, right? Because especially when the world is just beating you down. But giving people that kind of light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to mental health and going, hey, you know, you are going to be such a stronger, more resilient, better person because of this horrible thing. Curious of your thoughts on that, because it sounds like that's a lot of how you've taken your previous traumas and turned them around.
If I came to you with a suitcase full of money, call it $100 million tax-free, what do you just think your emotional response would be? Be happy, you'd be sad, you'd be angry, you'd be disgusted. Like, what would your just standard emotional response be?
Man, I'd be shocked.
Yeah. Pretty aftershock?
Fear.
Fear. Interesting. Fear. After fear? It's real. It's yours. You can have it. There's no catches.
No catches. Probably joy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My guess is after you go through the shock of this thing that's pretty big and out of left field, right? You're going to feel some joy around, wow, like what can I do with this given what this represents in the world? So I'll say it again in a different way, slightly. I'll continue with it. Someone gives you a suitcase of $100 million, you're generally going to welcome it with joy and happiness and excitement after you go through maybe the fear and the shock. If I give you a suitcase full of grief and disappointment, you're going to kick that thing to the fucking curb really quick. You're going to throw it off the bridge. That's how society generally functions. Anything that is difficult or challenging to be with, especially when it's emotional, especially when it involves grief, sadness, any deep, dense emotions, anger, etc., aggression, rage, we don't want to be with it. We suppress it and we repress it. We forget about it, but it still lives within us. Resilience is, in my opinion, defined by how we recover from a challenge. But the key there is meeting the actual challenge. In other words, if grief is alive for you and it presents itself, if anger is alive for you, ignoring it isn't going to be helpful. It's going to leak out. Not being with it is not going to be helpful for you. You're not meeting the challenge head on. It's not even head on. You're just not accepting it. You're not surrendering to it. You're not being with it. You can use any language you want, masculine or feminine language, how you want to actually be with it or what you want to do with it. Mm-hmm. But if we don't face it, if we don't accept it, if we don't welcome it into our worlds, it continues to agitate us. And we don't cultivate resilience. We don't cultivate a new expanded sense of self. We don't expand our window of tolerance where we can hold more. We don't actually heal anything that could be there to be healed, to make whole. So we keep or continue to walk around as fractured, perceived to be broken beings, and we pass that on to our most intimate relationships, our wives, our partners, our children, our friends, our workplace colleagues, our communities. It's not helpful. It's so important to cultivate an attitude and a culture of, can we meet the discomfort? Just like you would want to meet the comfort. Like you're going, if you've had a hard day's work or you've been up for 18 hours, when you come and lay down in your bed, can we meet grief if it presents itself, because that's life of duality. As an example, grief, can you meet that with the same sense of exhale, meaning that, oh, there's something for me to learn here. There's something for me to grow through. What a beautiful experience that I can experience the richness and diversity and range of all these different emotional states that make me human. And that when I do, just like the buffalo huddle together and move through the eye of the storm to get through it quicker, I will get through it quicker, and I will also learn something and grow through something in the process. And if I don't, that's okay, but I'm facing all of myself, not just parts of myself. How rewarding is that?
You know, that was life not very long ago. There was inherent suffering, and, you know, before we were industrious, before we were working in factories, before we had microwaves, before we had air conditioning, like we were plowing fields, and we were left up to the whims of the weather as to whether or not we're putting food on the table that season. And it almost seems like, you know, especially in the conversations I've had with parents who have kids in school, or the times I've spoken at schools and spoken to students, is that we don't like to face our negative, you know, I see that in quotation marks, negative feelings. We don't like them. We want to turn them off. We want to numb to them. And forgetting that in doing so, we're hiding, repressing, denying, we're shoving them down. You try and hold a beach ball underwater, guess what? It's coming out at some point. I want to ask you, you have quite a gift in communication. Like I mentioned previously, gift and something you've trained, no doubt, over time. What does it take for someone to be able to communicate these messages to men and women, let's just say, these difficult topics in a way that we can increase the chances of it landing or having an impact, especially if the people we're talking to are currently being afflicted or challenged or have been victims of such things that we're talking about? What is your approach to being able to get those messages or have that impact?
Leading with vulnerability and relatability really matters. Outside of any technical techniques in terms of communication, technical aspects of communication, being real, being honest, being in humility, not thinking because I don't know everything not even close. And the more I know, the less I know, as I think Socrates said. Socrates or Plato, I can't remember now. There you go, an example of not knowing.
A Stoic
yeah,
once upon a time said that. Yeah.
One of the Greek Stoics, yeah. And so I think leading with vulnerability and relatability and really speaking to the heart of someone is very helpful. And just being really real and honest and asking questions. So if I was to say three things, it's leading with vulnerability, relatability, and curiosity. And relatability comes from sharing. And the vulnerability I'm speaking to is more not being afraid to be in the emotional construct of what you're sharing and how you're sharing. And the curiosity comes in really wanting to know the other person. And the rest just comes from there, man. I mean, 75, 80% of all communication is nonverbal anyway. I don't know if that's a completely accurate stat, 70% plus somewhere
it's
there.
Very
right?
close. Very
yeah,
close.
It's
yeah.
very close there. So it's nonverbal. It's in our tones. It's in our afflictions. It's in our body language. It's in the way we look at someone. It's the way that our eyes show care. It's what we're thinking and feeling when that person is communicating to us, like really listening to people, asking questions and sitting back and just listening. Not asking questions so that you can respond with something intelligent, And I've learned all this the hard way, man, because part of my pattern has been to be very defensive and protective. Before our session today, we did a check-in and I shared with you, and it wasn't a long check-in, so I was pretty broad, but I can go into a little detail now. I shared with you, I had a conversation with one of the men in my men's group, and it revealed some of my shadows. It revealed some of the parts of me that are really being unconscious. And it wasn't any new information per se, but it was being highlighted in a really new way, which felt totally new information. And one of those pieces of information is that when someone comes to me with a question, like questioning my my actions, my nervous system immediately goes to being threatened and being, and
That's
them
me.
questioning me and not trusting me. And I immediately become defensive and vigilant as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of actually being curious and saying, where is this man coming from? Is it a combination of mistrust? Fair enough. If it isn't, can I be just okay with that? And is it a combination of him wanting something better for me and himself? Like, what's really going on?
Yeah.
But I'm so conditioned to myself be in mistrust and myself to be vigilant and myself to be defensive that I immediately become defensive. And even part of that is like, I'll gaslight. And that is not, I feel icky just saying that because that's not intentional. It's not who I am.
It's a survival mechanism.
But it comes as a byproduct. And I sort of noticed that today. I'm like, damn, I actually did gaslight him. Even though I was accurate in what I shared back to him, the timing of it was completely off.
Yeah.
And I got to own that. And if I don't own that, then I'm never going to change. And I'm going to constantly run into unnecessarily uncomfortable relational dynamics. And so, back to your original question, part of that is taking ownership, taking real responsibility for self. That's one of the ways that we're able to communicate better to others because people see you as less of a threat because they trust that you're going to actually take ownership of your shit. In order to do that, I'm sort of unpacking the layers here for you, right? Like in order to do that, you've got to really lean into your own inner work. Part of that is education and reading books and doing courses and, in-person stuff and somatic work and all of that, right? Trauma release practices and all of that stuff, but it's really being willing to do your inner work, particularly in relationship. It doesn't have to be a romantic partnership, but in relationship is where we learn to co-regulate. It's where we learn to dysregulate and co-regulate again. It's where we mirror so much. We are mirrored to so much of what we can't see within ourselves. So relationship becomes an integral part of growth in that way. And so all of those things combined, I believe really helps people in building trust with you, where you can then communicate to them in a really effective way. One last thing I'd say is the more you can know the person's nervous system, know their history, understand where they've come from, know who they are, know their triggers, you can communicate from a more loving and compassionate place, knowing their personal history. That's not always available. That's why leading with vulnerability, curiosity, and relatability is really helpful. But if you do know that person, taking that into consideration, knowing what their hot buttons are and not pressing them, because you're just not doing yourself any favors if you're pressing those buttons deliberately. Knowing them and then taking action to not press them, that's where the humility comes in, is very helpful when it comes to relationships and communication.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I'm snapping my fingers in resonance to a lot of what you're sharing because of the 4 horsemen that the John and Julie Gottman have coined in the demise of relationships, defensiveness is mine for sure.
Yeah, likewise, brother.
Because it's like a personal affront. And really what someone is doing when they call me out on something, if I'm getting defensive, then it's probably true what they said, or there's some unfinished business going on, in me that they're shining a spotlight on that I don't want to look at. And I've had men in my men's group do that with me. And I've gone from, despising these guys, wishing that they would take a hike and never come back, to learning that they've been some of my greatest allies and been some of the greatest gifts to me, that they were willing to challenge me in those ways. And now when it comes to relationships, there is a bit harder to see the black and white of it all, because there probably isn't any black and white in the enmeshment of relationships. I want to get your take on something first. This is a quote. I'm not saying I agree with it or disagree with it, but you marry your unfinished business. True, false, in the middle.
True. Yeah, true with nuance, but true.
Okay. How so, from your take?
We marry our unfinished business. Another way to say that is we attract what we need to learn the most. We bring and draw into our lives what is unresolved, unprocessed, not made whole within us. Why? Because we often cannot see the forest through the trees. We're relational beings. We relate to each other. We learn from each other, grow with each other if we allow that to happen. And people will come to our lives with a unique set of experiences, their unique set of gifts, ways of communicating, ways of being that often trigger and activate what is unfinished within us, or what needs resolution, or what needs to be made whole physiologically from a trauma perspective. And it's just our intuitive nature. It's our bodies knowing what to bring into our lives. And it can only often come in an intimate way. So these relationships usually are either romantic partnerships with our parents, siblings, really close friends. And there's opportunities to really grow through ourselves and our patterns that no longer serve us. And there's opportunities to grow out of what is really hindering us. The unfortunate thing is most of us don't know that's why we bring in certain tension, conflict, or challenge in our lives that is repetitive. We just don't know that it exists until we do deeper levels of inner work. And then we ask the question, the self-reflective question of, I'm the common denominator. I wonder what's happening here. And then we can start to explore, we can start to take more responsibility, which means you have to have, your ego needs to die, man. Your ego needs to constantly fucking die over and over and over again to really do your inner work, like to really humble yourself to your patterns and to yourself and to the changes you want to make. And it's really fucking hard work, man. And it is the hardest work that I've ever done, because when we dissolve the ego, there's a part of us, at least for me, that feels not only weak in that moment, but also defenseless and open to attack, because my nervous system's still very vigilant. It's my ego that has layers of protection, or at least perceived layers of protection. And so now I have to be vulnerable. I have to be open and surrender and trust something that's bigger than myself. Maybe it's God, maybe it's the divine, maybe it's something else. It's my higher self. It's something that's unknown. It's the great mystery, but I have to trust and lean into that. And every time I do, no matter how difficult it is, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. The first step's often the most difficult one. Often it really is, because there's so much unknown. But when we keep immersing ourselves in the unknown and we keep shedding those layers of ego, that's where deep, deep change comes. And so back to that original statement of, we marry our unfinished business. Yes.
Now, see, we're getting warmed up now, because I know this is your world that we're diving into right here, and I don't think I sensed a single filler word in any of what you just said. So that's yeah, I mean that's brilliant. You touched on a lot of things, ego being a big one, because I mean that's a lot of my work. Having experienced a lot of success at a young age. I was on a new warrior training just a couple of weeks ago, and dude, my tricks, my razzle dazzle, my whatever just wasn't working. And it was like, damn, why this is the thing that has always worked. I can be center stage and say these things and perform these ways. And it's not that how I showed up didn't have an impact. It was I internally was changing. I have been changing for a while. And in fact, it's because this man in my group challenged me around my ego. And I didn't want to look at it. So I started peeling away the pieces. And God, I turned into a puddle of mud. Just like, I can't keep it together anymore, because my way of doing things, my way of showing up, my way of being seen was changing, was transforming. Kind of like the caterpillar turns into goo before it becomes a butterfly. And I'm certainly not saying I'm out of the cocoon just yet, but I started to feel like the old dude at the bar that pulls out that folded up photo of him with a six pack in the 60s, being like, yeah, I used to look like this. That's how I felt about my previous accomplishments. And I'm like, wait a second, some of these were over 10 bloody years ago. Like, change the channel, man. Like, chuck the white belt on, create some new wins and some new rewards. And it was remarkably difficult to take that mask off, to remove those defenses. It still is, to show vulnerability through it, because it's something I've held on to for so long, and it just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't serve anymore. And my wife has had a front row seat to that. And I can say this in front of however many thousand people are going to listen to this and not care. I don't know a lot of you that listen, and it's not up to me to take offense to anyone's opinions about me. But when it's my wife witnessing this, that's when the stakes feel high. That's when the pressure feels really high, because in that sensitive place, she can help build me up through that, or she can cut my heels and hamstrings. Not saying she does, but she has the ability to.
Yeah. Well, why does she have the ability to?
Because I can stand naked in front of her and go, this is me. And she's the person I've chosen to spend the rest of my life with. And so I want to give her all of that, but it's scary.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is because you let her. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing. That's just a thing. But I mean, it can work all ways, right? But the fact that you let her, this is the opening to the great mystery, brother, that we're talking about. But you are surrendering to the thing that you perceive to be most valuable to you, and you're saying, "Here's all of me." That's courage, man. That is delayering the ego. You're allowing that. So I mentioned that to give yourself credit, and then to also like really give yourself acknowledgement, and also just to look into the areas where you may, I'm not saying that you do, but you may give her too much power.
Yes. And that is a beautiful segue, because this is something I want to talk to you about: polarity between the feminine and the masculine. And, you know, we've mentioned on the show many, many times, like, for anyone that thinks that masculine characteristics are only reserved for men, you know, pick up a book. It's we have access to all of them, and for a large part of my relationship. And I believe what I was attracted to in my wife is she's a badass, man. She gets things done. She's one of the hardest workers who goes above and beyond that I've ever met. And of course, there's so many things that I've fallen in love with her. But if we're talking about unfinished business, part of my shadow is the special boy that doesn't do the work and gets to enjoy the rewards without having done the work. And here's a woman that doesn't make excuses and just gets shit done and just does the work, and always has. And she's calling me now to step into my masculine. We want to have a second child, and she's indicating it's time for me to relax a little bit, maybe sit into my feminine. And so I'm getting called to step into the masculine a bit more. A part of that's, you know, right now interviewing with some companies out at the Pacific Coast, some tech companies, and going through that process has been remarkably vulnerable. But there's also a sense of purpose and mission behind it. Like, oh, here we go. All this work's been preparing me for this. So this is why it's very alive in me as we're talking about it. I'm sure you have some commentary on what I shared, but if you can explain polarity of femininity and masculinity, and how that plays out in our typical heteronormative relationships that we see between man and woman.
Something that we need to know about polarity in heteronormative relationship dynamics between men and women is that often what's underneath the expression of polarity or lack of polarity, which can be defined as magnetism, and I'll go into that a little deeper in a moment, is unresolved developmental or childhood wounds, actually. And it feeds into the quality of connection, because polarity is essentially intimacy and connection. And if that individual is coming to that relationship fractured or hurt or unresolved in their wounds and their patterns, and they bring that, it disrupts polarity, it disrupts attraction, it disrupts magnetism, sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual, etc. And so polarity is, for me, is just a beautiful blend of meeting each other where you're not. And so it's this complementary opposite, if you like, of coming together, literal physical merging, right? And also spiritual coming together as well, where it's not that you're not a complete being, you are completely complete as a being. And so is your partner, so is the person that you're with. It's that in the things you need to learn, in the things that you need to grow through from a relational, emotional, and spiritual place, your partner grants you access to that through their own lived experience, part of polarity. The simple version, I want to be very careful when I use the term superficial, because there isn't a negative connotation that I associate with that in this context at all. But the superficial polarity expressing itself is very physical and very sexual. Mm-hmm. And in this instance, it could be an example would be the man leads, the man or the masculine within that man penetrates and drives, and the feminine within that woman opens and receives. And there's a beautiful blending of each other when that is allowed to happen. And these individuals assume those roles organically within their relational dynamic. That doesn't mean that there's no conversation. That doesn't mean there's no communication around that. It doesn't mean that there's no deliberate exploration, but it also emerges organically. And so that's where I start with polarity. There needs to be, at some level, there needs to be a physical attraction that brings the essence and the eros of those individuals in deeper connection and harmony. And eros is the life force that permeates through us. It is the creativity that emanates from us. It is literally life force in everything that we do.
Yeah, dude, gold. Because there is the most masculine I will feel and have felt is when I witness my partner let go and open up and receive and trust that I can drive.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I have to drive all the time. There's seasons in life, but it's time to it's time to put my hands on the wheel and do a bit more driving than I have been.
You'll oscillate in partnership. You'll oscillate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's healthy to oscillate as well. I really do.
Yeah. So what is your, okay, let's look at it this way. What is divine masculinity or mature masculinity look like in yourself, in your relationship when it's present?
Mature masculinity for me in my relationship when it's present looks like deep ownership of my expression in that relationship, deep responsibility and acknowledgement and cognizance of who I'm being and what I'm doing in that relationship. In addition to that, there's layers of leadership where I'm proactive in taking responsibility for the direction of the relationship, where I'm really deliberately and purposely attuned to my wife's nervous system and what her needs are in that moment. And at the same time, checking in with myself and asking, can I genuinely attune to her and give her what she needs, whether it's spoken or unspoken? Do I need clarity? Do I need space? What do I need in order to fully support her? And is support what she needs right now? And if so, what does that look like? Do I need to ask her? Do I not? So I'm really proactive and I'm cognizant and aware of what's happening in my environment with her nervous system and my own nervous system. That's what healthy masculinity at a base level for me looks like in our relationship.
Beautiful. And what about your femininity? What does it look like when you let that come to the surface and that's what you're presenting with as it relates to your relationship?
So when I am allowing my internal feminine to be present in my relationship, for me personally, it's trusting my intuition. It's trusting what is coming forward in thought form and then being patient with how I express that, not necessarily blurting it out, but really sitting with that and letting it brew within me, and then bringing that in conversational form to my partner. It is also when I'm in my internal feminine is open, I am open to receiving the gifts of her presence, of her womanhood, of her personhood, of her intuition, of her wisdom, of her messages. I'm open to the requests that she makes. I'm leading with curiosity. I'm leading with vulnerability with her. And I'm then from that place choosing whether I can relate to her and really see her and feel her in that moment. But I'm leading with what is she feeling and what is her experience? And of course, what is my internal experience as well. But I'm really more open to her and I'm really leaning into trusting her intuition to also in part is key here, guide mine as well. And I'm trusting that her feminine intuition that I believe she has great access to can provide great value to what I am thinking and feeling at the same time.
Yeah. So she gets to lead the dance in that way.
Yeah. Look, man, I've worked with, you mentioned this at the beginning. I've been very blessed to work with some amazing fucking humans and solid leaders, high net worth individuals, billionaires, high-level government officials, leaders in their own right, special operations guys, top tier, tip of the spear guys. One of the greatest lessons I've learned is if you could, there's many ways to define healthy masculinity in a single way. One of those singular ways to define healthy masculinity is your ability to lead and to be led and to know when you need to do one or the other. That is a single defining characteristic of healthy masculinity. And isn't it interesting that being led is more considered a feminine quality? So when we're talking about all of this, brother, let me just sort of dial it down to how I see it in terms of polarity as well. We create quote unquote separation or contrast to create richness in learning. The contrast is masculine, feminine. It's two wings of the same bird, doing and being, going and flowing, active and passive, yin and yang. Why? To realize that it's all the same fucking thing and where it's all one in the same. We live in a dual construct, but with the basis of a non-dual reality. Yeah. And we have to be in the dual. And look, this is an opinion, right? This is a belief system that I hold true. There are competing belief systems to this, but we have to be in the duality to realize and actually embody the non-duality.
Yeah. It's kind of getting out of the binary, the black and white, men, women, masculine, feminine. It's understanding that there is that.
But you got to be in that to actually get out of that. That's the paradox.
Right. That's the paradox. Yeah.
Because
right? it's a both and, but it's oftentimes we have to earn our stripes in one of them to better understand how to enter the other.
So here's another thing, right? You mentioned black and white a while ago, and you mentioned it again now, which is great. Both black and white and both nuance exist at the same time and within each other and without each other, meaning that life is full of nuance because of the subjective multiple personalities, not multiple personality disorders, but multiple personalities that exist in this world, the multiple sparks of consciousness and expression.
Yeah.
And in moments, we have to be black and white. Not always, sometimes. Some moments will call for us to make a decision and be yes or no. Not maybe, not in the nuance. Sometimes we have to be yes or no. And it's not all the time, but it's sometimes. And so accepting both exist, and again, knowing when to lead and when to be led, and knowing when you need to be black and white within the context of your own life, and knowing when you need to allow and be more in the nuance of things, in the gray, is a tremendous gift to yourself and to so many others.
Final question for you. With the current culture that we're experiencing around masculinity and manhood, and many of the different mediums and platforms in which conversations are being had, arguments are being had, a lot of venoms being spat at this camp or that camp. What is your call to action to boys and men? And what's the gap right now that you witness that men and boys need to travel across to really step into that healthy masculinity?
The gap in masculinity is fear, uncertainty, and confusion in how to be healthy men, how to be in our healthy masculine expression. Boys lack the leadership and the modeling that is required for them to not veer off into their own high-risk behavior as they're developing from boys to men. And without that guidance and without that healthy, deliberate, structured modeling, boys are losing themselves. And as a result of that, there are many wounded, hurt men in the world. You would know this through your own experience. How many older men are coming to you wanting to be initiated into healthy masculinity? Men in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
So many men that still carry that boy energy because they're so disconnected and disoriented. And so my message to men is find and create spaces where you can be held accountable, where a light can be shone on your shadows, but where you can simultaneously be held and loved with compassion and non-judgment and called forward in challenge to be a greater version of yourself. And let the ego die. You're going to have to, and it's going to hurt. But But if you keep avoiding it, you always do what you've always done. You'll always get what you've always got. I think Tony Robbins said that. I don't know if he originated that, but whatever. It's a great saying. That's what I would say to men.
And on that, beautifully, that was just, yeah, mate, fantastic. And this is a great opportunity to mention to all of you listening out there who have been listening to the show, or perhaps this is your first time joining us. Here at the Mankind Project, we have 750 plus circles around the world in 30 countries. So you can create those spaces, or you can go where they already exist. And both are necessary at times, certainly. So go to mkp.org or mkpusa.org if you're here in the States, and you can look our search tab and you can find a men's circle near you. And if there isn't one there, like we've done here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, you can create one. And 3 years later, we got 50 men showing up routinely to support each other, hold each other accountable, and love on each other. And guess what? We're red, we're blue, we're black, we're white, we're gay, we're straight, we're atheist, we're pious men. We are so different in so many different ways, and we can bridge all of those gaps because we're there to support one another in becoming the best fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, citizens that we can be in this world and in this life. And Steph, mate, it's just been, you've really spoken to the power and the importance of that a lot in this conversation. So I've got so much gratitude to have spent this time with you and have had this conversation with you. How can our listeners find out more about you, work with you? Where can they find you?
Thanks, man. It's been a tremendous honor to be here. I feel very grateful to even just be called up by you and your organization. I feel very grateful to speak to a fellow Australian as well. I miss Australia,
nice.
Man. It's
yeah,
it is nice. Without getting teary, I definitely miss the land there very much. You can find me at Stefanos Sifandos on any social media platform, or most, I should say. And my website, stefanossifandos.com. And if you want to work with me, very simple, coachwithstef, stef.com. That's another way to connect.
Yeah, beautiful. There are phenomenal resources there. You can do his breath work. You could do, couples coaching, men's coaching, women's coaching. The work you and your wife do together is absolutely phenomenal. So I'll make sure there are links to all of those in the show notes. And mate, it's just been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being here. And yes, it's nice to speak to a fellow Aussie at times, especially it helps me miss the great land down under. Yeah. And so, of course, thanks goes to you. But of course, the greatest thanks goes to each of you that join us each and every week for this, the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there's more than one way to be a man. What do you say, Steph? Have we done that today?
Oh, I would hope so. I think so.
Yeah, I'll say we have. Lots of love. We'll see you next week. This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Boyson Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. That is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.
Hey, it's Boysen here with the Mankind Podcast. We are closing in on 100 5-star reviews of this podcast, and we have a goal. Brandon and I want to get to 250 5-star reviews. So help us out, will you? Please go to the Mankind Podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a review. Thank you. Hey, it's Boysen. On the Mankind Podcast, we've brought some incredible guests on to talk about the importance of doing the work to improve our mental and emotional health. And here's the truth. Multiple times over the last 25 years, I've had the help of one-on-one work with some amazing therapists. For me, for my wife, for both of us as adoptive parents, and for our kids. The Mankind Project and Men's Group, though awesome, are not a substitute for professional mental health support. And so I'm thrilled that the Mankind Podcast now has BetterHelp as a sponsor for the show. BetterHelp works online. It asks you what you're working on and then matches you for live one-on-one sessions with a licensed therapist, someone trained to work with you, listen, and offer helpful insights. I'm using BetterHelp. It's super easy, and I like what I'm getting. If getting one-on-one support in the comfort of your own space feels like a good direction for you, I invite you to check it out. Go to the link in the show notes or betterhelp.com/mankind. And if you sign up, you'll get 10% off your first month of therapy.